Hey YouTube, today I'm going to show you a quick video tutorial on how you can quickly and easily replace the rear brake rotors on your back disc brakes on your second generation Acura 1.7 EL. Raise the vehicle using a sturdy jack and making sure that you support the vehicle's rear end with some suitable jack stands on the jack support points just directly in front of the rear wheel. The other thing you want to also do is make sure that you have the parking brake completely released, otherwise you're not going to be able to actually undo the brake caliper properly from the car. Remove both the upper and lower caliper mounting screws using a 12mm wrench. You might not be able to use a 12mm socket on the back side here because of clearance issues. Remove the caliper assembly off of the rear brake pads. This can be somewhat difficult without the aid of using a screwdriver to prise this caliper off. And the reason why is that on the rear brake pads, specifically on this vehicle, there is a centering pin on the rear brake pads that the caliper must precisely follow so that the brakes actuate properly, and sometimes that makes the removal process of this rear caliper assembly a little bit difficult. But with enough wiggling and pushing around, you'll be able to get it off as such. Using a Phillips driver bit like this on the end of a ratchet, carefully remove the two Phillips retaining screws holding the rotor onto the rear hub assembly. If you're finding that the rotor is rotating while you're trying to spin the rear rotor assembly, you can always take a screwdriver as such, or a bar or similar pipe assembly like this to hold the rotor in place while you undo the screws. Now sometimes on these vehicles, these rear screws get really rusty and begin to seize up, so patience and lots of penetrating lube will always help. And of course, during the reassembly process, it's highly advisable to use some anti-seize compound or waterproof grease to prevent corrosion from seizing these screws inside the rotor assembly. Now these screws are optional for reinstallation. They're not absolutely required if you decide to leave them out. And the other thing too is that if these screws arbitrarily decide to seize inside these rear rotors, that you can just simply get yourself a nice high quality steel carbide drill bit, 3/8 or 1/2 inch in size, and then just drill them out until the rotor can be freed up. So now that we've removed these screws, let's now proceed to go and remove the pads out of the pad holder assembly. And again, with the aid of a screwdriver, just carefully pry these out, taking care not to damage any of the shims, clips, or pad itself. Now the rear pads on these vehicles tend to fit a little bit tight, so we're going to just use a screwdriver and a hammer to just gently tap on the pad casing itself, which is just right here, to unjam these pads from the rear disc brake holder assembly. Using a 14mm 6-point socket on the end of a 3/8 drive ratchet, proceed to undo the two 14mm screws holding the rear caliper bracket assembly to the rear axle hub. Because the rears here have such little clearance on the backside, I strongly advise that you use a shallower than normal ratchet handle, as well as with the aid of a breaker bar on the end of your ratchet. It will definitely aid on the removal of those rear bolts. They're not necessarily overly tight, but you have to remember that corrosion wreaks havoc on fasteners, making them extremely difficult to remove. Upon reassembly, you can choose, if you like, to install some anti-seize compound onto it, but not totally necessary. It's up to you. Once you've confirmed that you remove the Phillips screws holding the rear rotor to the rear axle hub assembly, we can now, and by the way, you've also removed the bracket so that this is spinning freely, we can now use a mini sledge like this and just tap the rotor in such a way so that this comes off. Now if this won't come off, Honda had a really ingenious little way of removing these things without doing any damage to the axle hub assembly. Now to remove the rear rotor off the rear axle hub, I'm just going to apply a little bit of penetrating lube to the center shaft of the axle. And the reason why is that rear rotors, I find, have a tendency to end up seizing or sticking onto the rear axle hub assembly, which makes removal a little difficult. And so to make life a little bit easier, I put some penetrating lube on, and then after a few minutes here, which or 10 minutes has passed, I'm just going to take my little mini hammer right here and just give it a few whacks, and it should come off as such. So when we've removed the rear rotor, we just want to inspect the center portion of this axle to make sure that there's no excessive corrosion built up. If there is, you need to use a wire brush or some emery cloth to just clean this all up so that the new rotor will sit flush onto this assembly. So in this case, this looks not too bad. It was a little bit stubborn to come off, but we can now take the new rotor and reinstall it. And so this is what the back side of the rotor looks like, the front side. It's exactly like the factory one. These threaded holes here is where the concave dimpled holes here on this rotor assembly, and the reason why is those dimpled portions accommodate that pesky Phillips tapered screw that holds this rotor on during the assembly process at the factory. It's up to you if you want to reinstall them. Mine came out relatively easily, so I'm just going to reuse them. Now, service tip here to prevent this from sticking to this in the future, and you can use this on your front rotors as well, it's all the same, is that we can use a little bit of this Permatex copper anti-seize lubricant. And basically what we're going to do is we're just going to take a little bit of it, and we're just going to kind of swab the center section of this rotor, and then just do a really nice thin coat of it on the back. And the reason why is that copper doesn't necessarily corrode the same way as steel does, and so that prevents this from rusting and seizing onto the back hub assembly. So we can then just simply take this, reinstall it, and like I said, it's up to you if you want to reinstall those little Phillips screws or not. I'm going to, but not before I cover them liberally with some anti-gray Permatex right here, gray Permatex anti-seize compound. Now, is there a major difference between the Permatex gray and the Permatex copper? There's a little bit of a difference. I find that Permatex gray is used for things like O2 sensors. I like using it for fasteners and what have you, but I've been told that Permatex copper is fantastic for brake components. To brake components is one of them. And then the other one was for gasket mating surfaces as well. I've never actually personally used it in that manner. That's just what I'm being told. So do so at your own risk, or if you want, you can do a little extra research and see. But either way, anti-seize never hurt anybody, especially products made by Permatex. I've been using Permatex for the last 20 years and never ever had it go bad on me and do detrimental damage to my car. Now, as we're reassembling these Phillips screws, if you choose to replace them or reinstall them, make sure that you coat even the inside sections of that conical area on the disc with ample amounts of anti-seize. I actually didn't coat it when I reinstalled this rotor, but I did coat that screw with a tremendous amount of it, so it should just kind of ooze out here. But basically, we're just going to screw these down, just hand tight. You don't need to torque them down to any appreciable amount of tightness. They're just there to hold it from wobbling, really. So we're going to tighten it as such, like that. Now the next step is we're going to now reinstall this lower bracket, or the rear caliper bracket assembly, to the rear axle hub. And so we're just going to sneak in behind this rotor here and just reinstall them. And then you can use your ratchet there and just tighten it down until it's hand tight, and then torque it down to anywhere between 60 and 80 foot-pounds. The precise torque figure I'm not sure on. I've always done brakes by hand tight and judging from my past experiences on the size of the fastener to gauge how tight something should be. I can assure you that these things don't need to be cranked down too tightly. If you do and you break that bolt onto the rear bracket, have fun drilling that out, because these screws are very strong number 10 strength bolts, so highly do not recommend you over tightening things. Okay guys, so the next step after we've reinstalled the caliper mounting bracket back onto the rear axle hub assembly is that we need to retract this rear brake piston back into its bore. And the reason why we need to do that is because your new rotors are going to be thicker, and so of course once you install the pads and everything, this is not going to slide onto the rear pads so readily because the difference in thickness. Your piston comes out as your pads or rotors wear down, so in this case the measurements are going to be different, and therefore that's why this needs to go back in. Now on Hondas, on the rears on Hondas, they cannot be retracted using a traditional C-clamp method typically found on front brakes or on other vehicles. But instead, Honda requires you to twist this piston back into its bore. And you could use a variety of different tools, 2 flathead bladed screwdrivers, a pair of pliers opened up to sort of wedge into those grooves here on that piston. But you know what, you can probably go to Pep Boys or AutoZone or Canadian Tire and buy a little tool like this called a brake piston retraction tool, and basically all it is just a little block of metal with all these little different nubs so that you can attach it to your ratchet extension to twist and turn whatever piston in, you know, a variety of different configurations, so you can sort of see what that looks like. But basically what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use these pins here, and I'm going to put them into those grooves onto that piston, and I'm going to start rotating this in a clockwise manner and just keep turning until this piston's completely retracted into the bore. Now, how do you know if it's completely retracted? Well, if you keep turning it and it stops going in any further but keeps spinning, that's indicative that it won't need to be screwed in anymore. Now, I just replaced these brakes on this vehicle the other day, and I just found that there was a little bit of brake chatter on the brakes, and that really annoyed me, so I just decided to just buy some new rotors and then install them. So what does that mean in the grand scheme of things? Well, once you retract a piston into a bore, you're actually displacing brake fluid back towards the master cylinder, and that could potentially introduce air bubbles into this air line, and of course air bubbles and brakes don't go well together. So for those that have partially worn brakes, you don't want to just retract it and walk away. You want to retract it, install everything, and then perform a full system brake bleeding procedure, and you can actually find that tutorial in my brake fluid flush and bleeding procedure video on my channel. Now, here's another interesting twist to Honda brake pads on the back of certain models of Acuras, Civics, as well as Honda Accords and other related models. Here's what a rear inboard brake pad looks like, and you can tell inboard based on this little metal squeal tab here. But here there's a little dimple that sticks up, and basically this dimple is an alignment guide pin for these little grooves on the backside of this piston. So how the pads sit in here is that they need to line up with those groove channels properly so that it can apply proper pressure to the back of the pads to provide even braking. If this guide pin is even slightly off from that groove, then you're going to have some serious braking unevenness, and then some massive brake pad wear that will happen in a short period of time. So in a nutshell, I'm not really sure I can demonstrate this in a video other than you're just going to have to you're going to install this pad, and you're going to have to just sort of trial align that center piston and those grooves there using your tool, and just got to twist it, you know, a little bit back and forth until you can get this thing to slide on perfectly and evenly. And then the final step is, of course, using a bright light to look down into this side inspection hole once this is completely seated on, and you'll be able to see this tiny little dimple sitting in that top groove there. If it's in that top groove, then you'd know if you've installed it properly. So let's reinstall the rear pads. So we have the pad here with the wear tang, the squeal tang on the end of it. And so I mentioned earlier that these rear pads are rather tight, so there's no corrosion or anything on my bracket or my pad, so I'm just going to use a hammer to gently tap those in until they've completely seated into the bracket. You don't need a lot of force because, well, you just don't. And then the outboard pad, same idea here. If you can see how I'm doing it, is until it's fully seated. Once you've properly aligned that pin, and that can be a rather challenging task, especially when you can't really see all that well in that little tiny inspection window, you can go ahead and proceed to retighten the rear caliper to caliper bracket bolts. And these don't need to be too crazy tight, just hand tight and a little bit more is more than sufficient to hold this all together. And there you go. Now, to be sure that this pin's properly aligned, before you even start the vehicle or lower the vehicle or go to the other side, you can actually step on the brake pedal a few times to pump it, to push that caliper piston back out, and you should be able to see from that point on whether or not it's aligned with that little pin on that pad. So I've just pumped my brake pedal a few times to push the pistons back out from the caliper bore, and I just looked into the side inspection window right here with a flashlight ever so carefully, paying attention to where that pin is relative to the grooves, and it's aligned spot on. It took me probably about 10 minutes of just kind of fidgeting back and forth with that little slotted brake piston, but it went in there perfectly. So now we're going to move on to the other side once we reattach the rear wheel. And I'm not going to demonstrate how to do the opposite side, because really, in a nutshell, once you do one side, it's all the same for the other. So I hope you found this video useful and informative. Rate, comment, and subscribe.